Welcome to our session on mobile advertising. I'm Mike Boland. I'm Chief Analyst with BI/Kelsey. And we're going to actually divide this 30-minute session into two presentations. One from me and then one from Walt Geer, who's the Creative Director of Verve Mobile, to really talk about some of the ways that one kind of leader and practitioner in the space is living out a lot of the principles that I'm going to go over in our forecast data. So to get right into that, if we could have that presentation up. There we go. So first, a bit about me. I'm a 10-year industry analyst, former tech journalist. My focus areas at BI/Kelsey are mobile, social media, and emerging technology. And one of the most important things I do per year, I should say twice per year, is involvement in our biannual local ad media forecast. And us analysts kind of divide into all of our respective coverage areas. We go into a cave for 2 weeks and come up with all of this data, crunch the numbers, the input data, the models to come up with our revenue outlooks within our respective coverage areas. So I cover mobile. And this year, for the first time, we decided that within mobile, it's so transformative, there's so much happening that we're actually going to drill down in a narrative white paper. That's going to be out in mid-January, and it goes into all the particulars, all of the stories behind the numbers, all of the drivers, and all of that. So a lot of what I'm going to go over in the next 15 minutes largely comes from that paper, and you can expect that in a little under a month. So quick bit about the methodology before I go into the numbers, and I don't want to bore you guys at the onset with a methodology slide. And this will actually be available readily for anyone. We're going to make this slide, all these slides available. It's the methodology, the fact that what I'm about to show you does not include tablets. That's a key point. And in short, our methodology involves a top-down and a bottom-up approach for those of you familiar with market sizing methodologies. But again, that's something you can read about in our full deliverable, and there are links on this slide. And again, these slides will be readily available. And I wanted to make sure that's true because I'm going to go over a lot of data, and I'm going to be going through it quickly. So there's a lot more you can kind of digest at your own pace. So another thing I want to go over in terms of definitions at the onset before I give the numbers is what do we mean when we say local? There's so many different connotations that people have with the term local and also location targeted. So what do we mean by that? So the number one connotation people usually have is where an ad shows up. And we talked about this a lot in our panel this morning on online to offline commerce. So the geo-targeted component of the ad. Where is it showing up to get in front of a user within a certain location? But more important, or equally important to where the ad shows up, is what the ad contains. So we're talking about things like calls to action, like call a store, get directions, things that drive local offline conversions. Anything with these components, we count as location-based in the numbers I'm about to show you. Also, product information. This is becoming more and more popular with things like Google's product listings ads. What products are available, real-time inventory data near me right now. That's another thing that likewise will count an ad as being classified as location targeted. Also the creative. This is important. We're going to hear from Walt next about the best practices in creative and really localizing that. This is often brushed over when we talk about location targeted best practices. Creative that has geographically specific ad copy or dynamic distance feeds within the ad unit itself. And then not only geographic copy, but also geographically related factors or variables, and one of those is weather. This is an example from Crunch Fitness. When it rains in New York, this ad is triggered to essentially be targeted to people nearby to convince them to come and run in a treadmill in the rain and stay dry instead of out in the rain. So those are the types of things we're talking about. Again, we're going to hear a lot of these examples and best practices from Walt next. And then lastly, audience targeting, which is another thing we alluded to in the session this morning, which is not just sending me an ad based on where I am right now, but really playing a longer game. And what were the last 50 places I was? And what does that say about me and profiling me in smarter ways as a consumer and sending ads in more intelligent ways than just the fact that I happen to be standing near an advertiser at the current moment? So those are all important and they're all developing, and the point is those are all the kind of types of things that we're talking about when we say location-targeted campaigns. So that said, onto the numbers. This is the kind of overall pie when we talk about US ad revenues coming from smartphones, growing from 32.6 billion in 2016, going to 72 billion by 2021. Now, the location-targeted portion of that ad spend now is at 38%. It's going to be growing to 45% by 2021. And really what's driving that growth are three things. One, user behavior, which tends to correlate to location intent on the mobile device. For example, Google reports that 30% of mobile search queries have an explicit local intent, which compares to about 10% on the desktop. Now, following behind that, the second reason is that advertisers are slowly but surely coming around to that reality and crafting campaigns with various flavors of location targeting, similar to what I went over on the previous slide. So it's the advertiser adoption that's likewise driving these numbers. And then thirdly, the performance deltas we see when campaigns are done right in terms of location targeting means that these campaigns usually come with a premium. So those larger dollar amounts for location-targeted campaigns, again, based on their performance when compared to non-location targeted benchmarks, means that that's further shifting these dollars towards location-targeted ad campaigns. Now, within that location-targeted segment, so the orange bars on this, within that, further subdividing by source of advertising, we can divide it between brand and SMB. So national brands that target things locally versus in-market SMBs. And right now, in location-based mobile ad targeting, it is predominantly the former, the brand advertisers, as they tend to have more savvy, deeper pockets, and they tend to be earlier adopters of kind of newer media. So right now, SMBs only represent about 11% of that total. But interestingly, by the end of our forecast period, we expect that to grow to about a third of the total mobile local ad spend, which is coming from SMBs. And one of the proxies there is that if you look at the overall location-targeted media pie, the BI-Kelsey measure, so that includes a lot of print and broadcast and desktop and other things, SMBs now make up about 36% of that total. Now, mobile, being younger, of course, now is at a lower amount for SMBs, but we believe over time it's going to evolve to be commensurate with that 36% we see in overall local media. But by the end of this forecast period, it will go up to about a third. Now let's get into formats. I think there's a lot of interesting learnings here with the share shifts and the trends we're seeing within the mobile ad spending in terms of what formats are performing and where the dollars are going. Now forget about location targeted for a minute, because this goes back to the overall 32 billion growing to 72 billion, but instead of dividing that by location targeted versus non-location targeted, it's now divided up by different formats. And I'm going to go through each of these one by one and give you definitions. But for now, at a high level, the kind of headline here is that search has been and continues to be the kind of dominating factor, or form factor and format. But by the end of the forecast period, it's starting to be eroded by some emerging types of formats. And by 2021, native social is actually going to eclipse search in terms of dollars. And I'll get into the reasons why. So let's go through each of these one by one briefly. So starting with search, as I mentioned, it's currently the largest share of mobile ad spending. And that's largely due to its higher performance. Its pull-based, high-intent-driven nature has been very attractive for advertisers. For example, among all the different factors we look at, one is a click-through rate, which is kind of a good proxy for performance, where search ad click-through rates on average are about 3%. It largely varies based on the ad position and ranking, but on average it's about 3%. If you compare that to a display ad click-through rate, it's about a 10x increase. So they're really performing well. But now the downside of search is it's starting to be deteriorated to a certain degree as more and more usage skews towards the mobile device and migrates towards the mobile device. Users are having their point of entry be apps. On the mobile device, on the smartphone, as we all know, it's more app-centric. So that content and the ad delivery is siloed into nice, neat little buckets known as apps. So it doesn't compel a search engine the way the desktop web did to really parse all of that information from the gigantic web. So that app-based orientation has really lowered search query volume. Not only that, but that affects the bid pressure, which in turn lowers CPCs, cost per click. So that mitigates the revenue opportunity for companies like Google. So Google, if you notice, over the last 5 years or so, most of their major announcements have been around learning to live in this more app-based world with things that are more predictive or push-based, and counterbalance that decline in search query volume and decline in CPCs that I mentioned with what they call micro moments, so reaching users throughout their day at different times through things like personal assistant apps or Google Home, which they just announced, or Google Allo and Assistant and all these other things, and what used to be Google Now. So I'll circle back to some of those things in a bit. But for now, the point is that search as we know it, which is typing something into a search box, getting 10 blue links and some ads, that's largely kind of starting to mature through the end of our forecast period. Display, or what we're calling traditional display, which is essentially banners, is growing from about $5.1 billion in 2016 to about $13 billion in 2021. Now, in terms of definitions, what we mean by traditional display and banners is it's not all display advertising, because there's a lot of display that is in native social that I'll go over when I hit that part of the presentation. But it's largely banners. It's growing moderately. I'm actually not too bullish on banners because they're largely seen as obtrusive. They don't perform very well. They're largely a holdover from the desktop era of digital advertising. And that's not to say they're inherently flawed. I think there is a way to do display right, and we're actually going to hear a lot of that from Walt. But the problem is, and the reason why I'm not very bullish on this, is that most people actually do them wrong with kind of shoddy tactics when it comes to targeting and creative and all these things. So again, we're going to hear some best practices from Walt on how you actually do display right. Messaging. This is an interesting one too. So messaging growing from 350 million this year to about 4.5 billion in 2021. The story with messaging, interestingly, it's actually the highest CAGR among all of our different formats. And that's simply because it's growing from a small base, but also it's reaching an inflection point. This is a category we used to classify just as SMS, which is an ad medium that was largely kind of in decline. And we've reclassified this as messaging, which now includes not just SMS, but third-party, over-the-top messaging apps like Facebook Messenger, which just reached over 1 billion users. And the thing with these messaging apps is they're not only being used for kind of peer-to-peer communication, but increasingly for kind of commercial interactions and transactional interactions with businesses. And we're seeing a leading indicator for that trend in Asia, where WeChat is one of the kind of most popular front-end interfaces for interacting with local businesses, and the same thing with WhatsApp in Europe. So what you see here isn't the transaction volume on these apps, which are much larger numbers, but rather the advertising and the sponsorship that is within these venues that is kind of leading people through these transactional interfaces through kind of conversations through messaging apps. So we're very interested to see how this is going to play out, because I think it's something that's fairly new and exciting to watch. And then video. Video is, of course, very important, growing from 2.5 billion in 2016 to 7.2 billion in 2021. Now, like display, I'm kind of parsing this. This is traditional video, which is essentially pre-roll. And it's 75% of those revenues are essentially YouTube. So we're going to go over some more video when we get to native social next, because that's where I think video, the real opportunity is. Like traditional display, it's growing moderately. People look at this and they usually think, why isn't this bigger? We always thought, like, video, mobile broadband, 5G rollouts, larger screens. We're hearing all this about video. Why aren't the numbers bigger? And that's because I think that the larger opportunity is going to be in native social. When it comes to pre-roll, it's something that I'm not very bullish on, because it's largely kind of interruptive to small screen video experiences, and largely taking kind of television-like spots, 15, 30, and 60-second spots, and kind of putting them on a mobile video, which hasn't really performed well. Those are the numbers we see there. Native social, this is the thing I keep alluding to, and this is the one I've saved for last because I think there's a lot of opportunity there, growing from 10.1 billion in 2016 up to 24 billion in 2021. Native social essentially is defined by advertising that is merged seamlessly into the scrolling vertical interfaces of apps, social apps, that are kind of built on that structure. So some examples are Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And what you see there is that there's a lot of inventory advantages in that scrolling interface as opposed to a static web page that has kind of a banner on the top and the bottom. They also perform a lot better because they're using targeting metrics, which are from this kind of rich data trove from the social graph in these very highly immersive types of experiences where people spend a lot of time, such as Facebook. The kind of affinity data that they have, the profiling data is very strong. So this combination of all these advantages in this kind of native social format have made them perform very well. A quick example is a lifestyle brand like Ray-Ban can really kind of make artful photography and add that to their Instagram account for their followers to see, but then pay for that to be amplified further and those posts to be distributed further throughout the network to all Instagram users or just kind of affinity groups they want to target. Snapchat's another example that's gaining a lot of steam. Its stories format allows brands to kind of aggregate and curate rich media around a given event during a different time period and really capture like the vibe of a conference or something like Coachella, which Heineken did. So it's very location enabled, it's very temporal, and it's very relevant. And the key point, though, is that this is something that's very much resonating with millennials. Millennials are largely untrusting of traditional forms of advertising, like some of the ones I went over in traditional display. They don't like to be told what to do or what to buy. So these more kind of subtle and elegant and kind of experiential campaigns around things like Snapchat stories or Instagram photos and some of these things are really landing well with millennials, which is of course important due to the generation's growing buying empowerment. And then, it's more multimedia enabled, some of these apps. I went over video on the last slide. Again, we're very bullish on video in terms of 5G rollouts, in terms of larger screens, but I think it's going to be in these formats where they have kind of a very cleverly integrated start-stop functionality in that scrolling feed, as opposed to kind of pre-roll and just kind of slapping TV ads onto like a mobile video. This is where we're really going to see video shine. And then lastly, the calls to action that we're increasingly seeing integrated with these types of ads. So on Instagram, to be able to tell where locally I can buy something that I've seen, whether it be clothing or back to the kind of Ray-Ban example. So those kind of calls to action to make it actionable on top of being very immersive from a brand perspective. So in closing, 3 very quick kind of takeaways. Search, as we know it, is under siege, and as we know it is kind of the operative clause there because it's search in terms of a search box, 10 blue links. We're seeing voice search. My prediction for 2017 is that 30% of mobile search queries are going to be voice. We see personal assistant apps as a kind of easier and more seamless front end to a lot of what used to be search behavior. So that's Cortana, that's Siri, it's Amazon Alexa, it's Google Allo and Assistant, and through the home interface that they have. I frankly think that Google is going to win that battle among all those players because it has the best data, it has the best knowledge graph, and those are the types of things that are required to kind of win that battle. I think others might win on front-end interface or in categories like e-commerce where Amazon Alexa might win, but overall, I'm calling Google as the winner in that race. Native social is mobile's greatest ad opportunity. I just went over that, so I won't belabor that point. And then lastly, mobile isn't about ads, it's about action. We went over this in the morning panel on online to offline conversions. And really, it's about capturing user behavior where it is and providing a number of things, mostly just the right calls to action to get them to convert offline, and then also having good creative. So effective ads with good creative that's location enabled, and the proper calls to action. And rather than go through that, again, we're going to have Walt really give some examples of what one leader and representative example in the industry is doing in terms of best practices to really drive this stuff, drive that offline conversion, and to do so through just good ads, good action, good creative. So Walt, why don't you come on out? Please join me in welcoming Walt Geer, Creative Director of Verve Mobile.
Can I give you a hug?
That was amazing.
Thank you.